This is a review of the 1970 Gilbert Cates film I Never Sang for My Father, which stars Melvyn Douglas, Gene Hackman, and Estelle Parsons. What a phenomenal cast that is. It's based off a play directed by Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson wrote the screenplay for The Nun Story, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. He was mainly a playwright, but he had his hand in a few films. I think I'm going to be looking into more of his work, as if you haven't already guessed, this is really a great movie. Not only is it my kind of movie, but I think it is universally really a good movie. And I would say that out of every movie so far that I've done an individual review for on this channel, this one is the best. Not only is it hugely compelling and hugely emotionally powerful, but it's also incisive and will linger with you. What does that mean exactly? Well, we'll talk about it more at the end. But suffice to say, this is a really great movie. This movie is from 1970, and it's yet another movie on this channel from the 1970s. Why have I done so many reviews of 1970s movies? Well, it's because I think it's the best decade in American cinema. That isn't to say that every single 1970s movie I've reviewed is good, or American, for that matter. But I am particularly interested in the era, because I think the stars kind of aligned in the United States in the 1970s. You had innovations from the French New Wave, which started in the 60s in Europe, were coming to the United States. People were taking more chances, more risks, doing more innovative things. But at the same time, you had some classic traditions still going on. Bringing those two together creates, I think, one of the finest generations, a time of American auteurism, where we had proud American directors. Some people also refer to this as the film school generation, because this was one of the first times where people who were coming to Hollywood had been to film school. Although some of the directors that get talked about this, like Steven Spielberg, I don't find to be super compelling. But in general, what a great time for movies in the United States. The best time, in my opinion. And this movie, I think, does a great job of showcasing the bold new ideas, but also traditional sort of classic ideas coming together to form really great movies. Like I said, this is a great movie, an astounding movie, even, I would say. A huge part of that is the acting. So Gene Hackman is in it, playing a character named Gene Garrison. Who's kind of a low-key, mellow, meager almost character. Melvyn Douglas, on the other hand, is his father, who's a huge figure, a titan. Estelle Parsons is Melvyn Douglas's daughter, Gene Hackman's sister, and she plays sort of an exiled but strong-willed, strong-minded, willful sister. What's this movie about? Well, it opens with this quotation: "Death ends a life, but it does not end a relationship, which struggles on in the survivor's mind toward some resolution which it may never find." And that is the movie. I guess to be a little bit more literal, the movie is about Gene Garrison, trying to figure out how to balance his aging parents and his own desires. In particular, Gene is thinking about moving to California to get married, but he doesn't want to leave his family behind. This is a hyper-realistic, extremely natural, humanist story about aging and relationships. And the quotation I gave, "It ends a life but not a relationship, which will struggle on, looking for some impossible conclusion." That really is what it all comes to. And that means there's a lot of this movie that isn't what's on the paper, but it's all the fallout of what might go on afterwards, right? The events in the movie are one thing, but then there's the characters living with these relationships for the rest of their lives. That is another thing. Like I said, an incisive movie as well as a compelling one. The weakest part of this movie, I think, is the beginning. And that's not saying a lot, because this movie is really, really strong overall. But the beginning takes a little bit of time for the movie to warm up. Now, the very beginning is that quotation, which is really nice, given in voiceover over a picture of Gene and Tom. And then you go to an airport scene where Gene is going to he goes to the airport, and he asks the desk clerk for a wheelchair. This is a sort of a subtle moment, sort of a simple one, but it already sort of foreshadows a certain vulnerability there. Gene Hackman, young, spry in the airport, but asking for a wheelchair. What's that about? Well, he's going to meet his parents, and the wheelchair is for his mother, who's not capable of walking long distances and such. In some ways, not a dramatic moment, but in other ways, it's, I don't know, sort of an oblique way to start a movie, asking for a wheelchair. In the beginning, the characters might seem slightly simple, slightly tropey, stereotypical old couple or something like that. But I think the idea here is that you get to know them quickly. You get the basics quickly, and they get more complex as things go on. Now, I will say, there are a couple of slightly weird things in the beginning, like there's a bit of a song that's used with lyrics and such in the beginning of the movie that doesn't quite fit the rest of the movie in some ways. But in a lot of ways, the movie's just sort of getting started. And that song, I think you'll sort of forget about. There's also one sort of really janky handheld shot near the beginning of the movie that seems kind of out of place or something like that. One of the things that's sort of a hallmark of this era in some ways is getting cameras off the tripods and getting off of sets. That is derived from the new wave where with smaller, more portable cameras, people would actually go film things out on the street. Now, these movies are not necessarily filmed out on the street, but there are more interesting camera angles and movements, including one handheld shot that looks like the camera operator tripped 3 or 4 times while filming it, but oh well. At this point in the movie, you do get the main vibe, which is that this is sort of a movie, it's a humanist, hyper-realistic movie, something along the lines of Cassavetes, but not quite as bleak and not quite as unrelenting. More saccharine, I guess. And the beginning of the movie seems a little bit saccharine and a little bit sentimental. But by the end, most of that is kind of washed away. And like I said, maybe you just think of the movie as getting started a bit slowly or giving you an easy way in to understand some of the characters. From there on, the movie really just goes through the gears. Like I said, the main conflict is that Gene wants to go to California to get married, actually to remarry. He's widowed. But leaving his parents is tricky. That's a small part of it, but really, it's just the beginning. And I think one of the main virtues of this movie is just how thorough it is. In a lot of movies, a lot of like action movies or just sort of dramas, there are answers that are not explored, right? There's some sort of big central conflict, and in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, why don't they? Surely they could just, do X, Y, and Z. There's some way out. And maybe sometimes they are like, oh, they have some throwaway line, like, it's fine. Or we can't do this because there's this thing, or something like that, which is just sort of mentioned not very convincingly for a second to put that to rest. Well, this movie's kind of the opposite. Every possible thing that could be a conflict, everything that's mentioned or brought into a conflict, will eventually sort of rise in time. All the backlog of issues in the relationships will eventually come to the forefront. And all of the potential solutions to some of these issues, the sort of the central problem of aging parents, are explored. All the different possibilities, all the strategies are tried, which is nice to see. In general, we've got a strained father-son relationship. And let me go into some detail about exactly these characters, because this is really the meat of the movie. Tom Garrison, which is Melvin Douglas, the older character, is aging, but still dignified, sort of. This is an incredibly vivid portrait of the elderly. I'm sort of torn about whether or not I would recommend this movie to somebody with elderly parents or somebody whose parents are towards the end of the life or who have passed away recently or something along those lines, because it is so devastating and real. I'm not sure if it would be, if it would stir up more emotions or if it would put things to rest and be cathartic. But certainly it touches on all those ideas. And this Tom Garrison character, right, one of the things that's so interesting about his character is how he manages to be simultaneously totally there and vividly himself, but also not there and missing. And this, I think, that's something I've seen in my grandparents, where they continue being themselves incredibly vividly, but at the same time, they can't remember things. They repeat stories. They don't seem to grasp things exactly. But at the same time, like I said, they're still so vividly themselves, and they're committed to doing that. And Tom Garrison in particular, because he's such a sort of stickler, such a proud man, is deeply invested in still being himself, if that might mean not acknowledging his circumstances, not coming out, and talking openly about his frailty, and something like that. And maybe he's aware of it, but perhaps afraid of admitting something like that, clinging on to his own personality or something along those lines. And so there are many sort of conversations, difficult conversations to have, where you think, okay, we're going to go talk to Tom about, let's talk about, rest homes or something like that. And you start that conversation off from a point where he's barely even acknowledging the fact that he might even need care. Instead, he's in tip-top shape. Everything is perfect, even though you know that that is not the case. So some of the persnickety nature of elders, but at the same time as you have all these sort of downsides, this character, and this is one of the fundamental virtues of the movie, this character is still deeply empathetic. Somebody that you really connect with, somebody that you really feel for and appreciate, even as he's a tough father, even as he fails to admit or is afraid to admit his own weaknesses. And that's a really tricky line to cross that is absolutely nailed in this movie from a great role by Melvyn Douglas. There's a lot to say about this character. A couple other things is, there's some of the nice sort of acting method things they put in there, not method, but some of the sort of strategies that are used to portray this character, for instance, are repeated stories, right? So not the greatest memory is shown a number of times. And often you see this, like, amnesia is very frequently played comedically in a movie where characters can't, remember, who am I talking to? Characters can't remember. This is all sort of a joke. It's really over the top. This movie takes really a different route. Like I said, this is a tender and an earnest character, and hearing stories again and again is a really interesting and ultimately a pretty powerful move that this movie makes, where you hear these stories, they sort of are churned up to the forefront again and again, sometimes slightly altered, sometimes exactly the same, and then there are moments where new things creep in, and overall, it ends up being a really powerful portrayal, but I think you get the point. Let's talk about Gene Garrison. So this is Gene Hackman's character, and he's quite different from his father, at least when he's in the presence of his father. He says something along the lines at one point of how being around his father makes him feel smaller, makes him shrink, or something like that, which I think that's a sort of a powerful idea about why you should have certain people in your life and not others, maybe. This, in a lot of ways, might be different from what you're used to for Gene Hackman. If you think about some of Gene Hackman's most famous roles, like in The French Connection, I think Popeye Doyle is the name of his character there, maybe something like that. Sort of a gruff character, and a lot of Hackman's sort of later roles are kind of gruff, but this movie is completely different. He's a lot younger, and it is a tender and sensitive character, and one that you can connect with. One of the interesting things they do with his character is that often he will talk about how he's feeling about something. For instance, as I just said, he says that being around his father makes him feel smaller. Sometimes lines like this would be totally hokey, totally against the rules of writing a good screenplay. You're not supposed to have the characters come out and say exactly how they feel, but in this movie, he pulls it off. And these moments don't feel hokey. Instead, they feel like vulnerability, and they feel real, which is really interesting, and just another hallmark of a fantastic script. This movie just has so many things going for it. Like I said, it's extremely thorough, really explores everything as far as it possibly could. Another thing that I think that I really like about this movie, and it's something that I have personally termed orthogonality. Maybe there are other phrases or terms for this, but I'm not really aware of it. To me, this idea of orthogonality is the idea that characters, or people in the real world, are all living their own lives and whatnot. They're all the protagonists of their own life, you might say, if a bit trite, but so be it. People are all on their own journey, on their own path. Sometimes those paths cross over, but people have their own things in mind and their own lives. And movies are, in general, pretty bad at showing this, because movies try to unite characters for some common reason or something like that. People are in the same place at the same time for some reason. They have something in common, something brings them together. Where in real life, most of the time, that kind of thing is actually coincidence, and our lives are really defined by being quite different. So there's some movies, like Until the End of the World, the Wim Wenders film, I think is one of the best movies out there for orthogonality. Well, this movie also does a great job of showing just how people's priorities, people's lives, people's goals are different. And on the surface, that might seem sort of obvious, but they do this not only at sort of the high level of a plot, but also at like the micro level of individual conversations. Like I said, there are sometimes they go to talk to Tom, and he's just not very conducive to having certain conversations, right? He's going to make it hard for you to talk to him out of his earnestness, out of his commitment to being himself, he'll make it hard for you to talk about your priorities and to surface them. So kind of interesting. Another huge virtue of this movie is emotional undercurrents, right? So something that I really like in this movie is that characters will often say one thing. They'll say they're upset about one thing when really something else is going on. For instance, the sort of most simple example of this would be you wonder if Tom Garrison, as he's complaining about all kinds of things that he complains about. For instance, he has a few goes at, I paid for your clothes and your school, and did you ever thank me? Right? Well, is he concerned, or is this character concerned about, the actual financial balance sheet of their lives? No, almost certainly not. That is sort of a way of expressing some other emotional undercurrent, probably related to the frailty of aging or related to some other thing going on in the relationships, in the backlog of the father and son and the sister and the mother, of course, and all their time together. And this movie, I think, does a really, really good job of that. And this is hard to write a good screenplay that doesn't keep everything on the surface. But this movie is sly. And yeah, like I said, there's a lot of things where the literal things, the things expressed by the characters, are only part of the story. Other things about this movie, like I said, it has some moments of new style in it, right? So this is stuff sort of borrowed from, stuff sort of coming from the new wave. I mentioned the handheld shot. That's not that great, but there's some other things that are good. For instance, you get some interesting abrupt cuts in this movie. These mostly come in the form of flashback. These are not at all sort of classical editing flashbacks where you see a big clock and then you hear the harp music and it will fade into something before. Instead, this is sort of a very abrupt cut where they'll show just like a second of something that happened before. They make interesting use of sound, sometimes in conjunction with this. For example, there's a moment where where Gene is describing his father. He's hanging out with a woman that he sees sometimes, who I think one minor weak point of the movie maybe is that this character is sort of useless and is only in the movie so that you have this scene where Tom can explain his feelings to somebody else. But we'll let him live for this. As he's describing his father and all of his father's great past achievements, you hear some nice parade music in the background. This use of sound is kind of weird, not at all classical style, much newer, something like that. There's also a very interesting sequence stylistically when Gene goes to visit an old folks home, a retirement home, to check it out and see what it might be like for his father. The way that it is filmed is very interesting and uses a lot of sort of modern techniques, abrupt cuts and sound both, to show something much more than just the classic literalism of what's going on. What else is good about this movie? Well, a lot. The mother and the sister in this movie are strong characters. So Dorothy Stickney plays the mother. She's mostly a character actress. One of the things that's so interesting about her character is how she managed to carve out a real spot for herself in the world, where Tom, her husband, is such a big character, such a titan, and yet she has a totally natural and alive, vibrant life for herself. She's not sort of under the control of him exactly. There is some sort of natural symbiosis there, and it really, their relationship, just like every other relationship in the movie, just seems so spot on in the way that the mother and Tom have found a way to love and to be interested in one another after so many years, and the way that she's carved out a life. Now, Estelle Parsons, the sister, Alice, is also a phenomenal character. Headstrong, has her mind made up, but is also profoundly uncertain. That's another tricky balance, but absolutely nails it. A little detail of her character is that she adopts a particular voice when talking to her parents, the old person voice. A lot of people in the movie sort of do, speaking out a bit louder so that the old people can hear you. Just another lovely little detail. Finally, one other detail I love is there's a scene with a waitress that is just so spot on with when Tom and his wife return back to, I think, I'm not totally sure where they live, some suburb of New York, maybe Connecticut somewhere. And they go back to some restaurant that they had been in Florida. They returned to some restaurant that they hadn't been at a lot. And the actress there who plays the waitress, she was only ever in 2 movies. Can't remember her name. Maybe she was a real actress. The way that she understands the weird relationship that might go on between like this sort of older man who's really sort of trying to be chummy with everyone, and really invested in being himself, and how that might interact with a waitress who's just doesn't really have any interest in that, but is going to play along because it's her job. Tricky dynamic. I think you probably know the kind of thing I'm talking about, and absolutely nailed in that little scene. So, I mean, overall, I think you probably get the idea. If you know anything about the kind of movies I like, well, this is a movie for me. An extremely mature film, an emotionally taxing movie, a hard movie to watch, a movie with really, really great acting. And I will say that the final scene in this movie, maybe not technically the final scene, but you'll know what I mean if you watch it. There's a huge, long, extended scene, maybe like 20 minutes even, to end the film. I think it is one of the best scenes I have ever seen anywhere. The acting there between Melvyn Douglas and Gene Hackman is unreal. That scene is amazing. And that quality of acting really continues. Even the waitress nails it. Don't know what was in the water when they made this movie, but really, really phenomenal acting and script. And overall, like I said in the beginning, this is a movie that lingers, a movie that matters. And I don't like this idea of like, oh, this movie changed my life, or anything, because it feels like life-changing. Like when something is life-changing, sometimes that seems to me like more of a literal thing. Like I watched the movie and I decided to go, skydiving or something. Of course, I think maybe the life-changing properties of skydiving might be overstated too. But that's for another time. This movie, will it make any literal changes in what you do? I don't know. But I'm 100% sure that it will resonate with you deeply, and that it will stay with you for a long time. And that's a phrase a lot of people end up falling back on. It will stay with you when describing movies. And what does that really mean? Well, I guess it's what it sounds like. This is a movie that I know that I'll think about a lot. This is a movie that I feel like, maybe this is a good way to put it. I watched this movie and I thought, man, everyone I know with older parents, I gotta show them this. How could you not? It'd be so valuable for people to see and think about and understand, I think. And since just about everyone has parents, or maybe even kids, I would recommend this movie to just about anyone. Like I said, obviously this is a mature, sad, downer, brutal movie. So be aware of that. But really, you didn't need anything that I told you to understand or to get this movie. Maybe it starts a little bit slow, but man, it gets going. And overall, I Never Sang for My Father is, like I said, I think the best movie that I have reviewed on this channel so far. One of the most affecting movies the most affecting movie I've seen since the winter, I think, a number of months, and a movie that will make a lasting impression. So I strongly recommend I Never Sang for My Father.